So I think that, neurofeedback training could be a huge component of just improving that whole population, of just creating societal change by, each individual person's brain.
I joke around and say it's like the East Coast, West Coast beat. Or like Tupac versus Biggie, the almost clicks in the different parts of the mental performance or mental health umbrella.
But the way I explain like neurofeedback to people is it's a tool in your psychological toolkit. It's not the be all end all. Fixing the brain on a biological level, and then people's behavior ends up getting so much better.
Hey, what's going on, everybody? It's Nicholas Davenport, aka Mr. Mental Muscle. Today on the Mental Muscle podcast, we have Toby Passman. Now, me and Toby met about 2-3 months ago, and we shared a connection on the brain. And we're big on adding value beyond just what we do. We're big on sharing ideas and getting the mental health side of things, the neuro side of things. Because, like I always say, Mind, Body, One, that's my company. Get your mind right. You can't do that just with one modality. So I'll let him introduce a little bit more about him, what he does with his company, and we can just get right into it.
Yeah, man. Thank you so much for having me here. So my background is in neurophysiology research. So that's how I kind of got started within the field. I took a biopsychology class back in undergrad. Didn't know what I was going to study or what I was studying at the time, but I took this biopsychology class that really piqued my interest because to me, psychology was really cool. I enjoyed like the intro psych classes, but it was a bit too theoretical for me. I liked kind of the science, like the being able to actually see some hard data, some science. So to me, biopsych really piqued my interest. I started working at a research lab in my undergrad at an EEG lab, basically measuring people's brainwave activity as they would go through this computerized task, which basically measured their generosity, where they could give money or not to a fictitious charity in like a variety of different like contexts. There'd be different kind of propositions, but we'd be measuring both EEG along with HRV. So I got really experienced just in collecting that data in college, but we didn't really do anything like to improve people's EEG or HRV, right? It was just simply the collection. So outside of college, or as I was finishing up college, I was really left with the question of like, okay, like neuroplasticity, like we can change and improve the brain. How do we go about doing that? So I, at the time, was following like Dave Asprey, like the Bulletproof blog, biohacking, and went to one of the Bulletproof conferences, which was back like 2017 or something, and met the team at 40 Years of Zen. So this is like a neuroscience. They're like a neuroscience meets personal growth retreat. It's like a 5-day retreat outside of Seattle, Washington. And they
That's
take
where
on.
you're from originally?
I grew up in Eugene, Oregon.
Oh,
So
okay.
yeah, like 6 hours down the interstate. But ended up moving up to Seattle like after college and really had my mind open to like so many cool ideas of basically the way they did this program of stacking together like neurofeedback training. So actually not just measuring the brain waves at this point, but actually training and rewiring someone's brain waves to enhance cognitive performance, to improve mental health. And then they stack that together with different nootropics, different supplements. They had like a private chef there where they're making all gourmet, grass-fed, everything really, really good food, and also doing the psychological coaching, a lot of one-on-one and group coaching work. So that was a really cool experience, like seeing that program in place. And then I ended up coming to Florida to get mentored by a doctor, Nicholas Davenport, here, who's actually not too far away from here in Deerfield Beach, but really learning both neurofeedback and brain mapping in a lot of depth. So he has been doing this for like 3 decades. And I basically came here to get mentored by him. So I got a board certification in brain mapping and QEEG, and then one in neurofeedback, and just did a super deep dive and, really saw some amazing results with my own social anxiety doing neurofeedback training. And then also just with the countless clients like that I've worked with, ranging from the peak performance to substance abuse and addiction to mental health, even to like in neurology, traumatic brain injuries, stroke recovery. Like, so it's really like a wide array of people that I've seen, do really well with neurofeedback training.
So yeah, you said a lot of things that I also believe in, like you say, stacking things together, having a different approach. Because I think with mental health and brain health, there's this umbrella term where everyone pictures it one thing or another. They think either it's like being more in the zone or mindfulness. They do things like say box breathing or things like that. Or it's more so like say the therapy or coaching, things like that, or it's neurofeedback. And it's always this segmented. I joke around and say it's like the East Coast, West Coast beef. Remember, we're old enough to remember that. Remember like Tupac versus Biggie. And it's like, I feel like it's sometimes like not in an aggressive way, but in more of a philosophical way, how if I'm let's say I'm a psychologist, my original background was in clinical psychology. I did personality and cognitive was because you said yours was more physiological. So the classes I cling to more when I was undergrad was cognitive and personality, which is shown a lot through my methods today. But getting to my point is when I was in that program doing my clinical doctorate, it was a lot of this or that. It was no like we're both on of let's bring it all in because how can the brain, the mind, the mental health be better if we're only focused on one aspect? Because we're not one dimensional beings in practice. So what do you think about it? Have you seen that at all? Because I've seen it actually a lot more than I would like to say the almost clicks in the different parts of
Oh,
the mental performance or mental health umbrella.
Oh, even within the field of neurofeedback, it's such a divided camp. There's so many different types of neurofeedback, and all the different people in the camp are so divided. And there's so much like beef and tension. It really is like the East Coast, West Coast beef. Like within the neurofeedback field itself, like there's not enough like cross-disciplinary work, in my opinion, as there should be. But the way I explain like neurofeedback to people is it's a tool in your psychological toolkit. It's not the be all end all. If you're doing neurofeedback training and you're getting 3 hours of sleep at night and you're eating Cheetos and like you're not going to get results in the same way. You could train really hard at the gym, and if you're not getting proper recovery, proper sleep, your nutrition sucks. Like you're not going to see the results, the changes in your physique that you want. So in the same way with neurofeedback training, it's just another tool. And all the stuff, the foundational stuff, the nutrition, the sleep, exercise, that's what I try to emphasize to clients the most is like, you got to take care of that stuff. Neurofeedback, nootropics, these are cool things to start adding on to kind of get your brain, maybe from like 90 to 100%, right? Like get that extra, that last little push. But there's so many foundational things that if people aren't doing, like they're not going to have good mental health and not have really great brain performance.
So I want you to explain because neurofeedback, we've said this term dozens of times since we've started, and some people still may not get it. So I want to
Yes.
do it like a real in
Yes.
person challenge. I want you to explain it 3 times.
Okay.
As if I'm 5, as if I'm 18, fresh out of high school, and as if I'm a PhD in this in neuroscience. So
Okay.
5-year-old,
This can be
fresh
fun.
out of high school, PhD. Because I feel because I used to be an educator, I taught middle school, high school, and then eventually college as an adjunct. And it's like learning levels. You got to really be able to jump between people where they're at. And I know with neurofeedback, when I was a neurofeedback tech, I had my own like analogies and things I would do. So I want to. I don't mean to put you on the spot, but
Yeah, no,
hey,
this can
get
be
your mind
fun.
right is my slogan. So let's get some
Yep.
minds right. So 5-year-old.
Yeah, 5-year-old. So your brain can change. Neurofeedback teaches your brain how to change in the right direction. How's that for a 5-year-old?
The right
Think a
direction.
5-year-old might get that?
I think it's understandable. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So the
Okay.
next one, high school
High
grad.
school grad.
Okay. So high school grad with a psychology, any sort of
Let's
psychology, or
assume
just
they
like a
just
general,
know
like high school kid.
They're
Okay.
not necessarily a valedictorian.
Okay.
They're not necessarily a burnout. They're just 3.0 GPA.
Got it.
They did what they need to
Okay.
do to get out of school.
Okay. So neurofeedback holds a mirror up to your brain in the same way if you're looking at a mirror and you see reflected back, you see how you look, you get kind of feedback as far as like if your shirt's not done right, if your shirt's wrinkled, you get that feedback from the mirror. So neurofeedback is kind of holding up a mirror to your brain, showing it areas in which it's functioning well, areas in which it's not functioning well in order for the brain to self-adjust and rewire itself to improve its functioning. That's
No,
how I'd explain it
I'll
to
take that one. I like
a
that. I
high
like
school
that
grad.
mirror now.
Okay.
Like I said, I love analogy, so I
Yep.
like that one. And
Yep.
that's definitely a high schooler can get that. So the last one, now you're talking to someone who has just as much knowledge, maybe even more than you.
Right. And that's always the toughest because I feel like it's so interesting where it's like the hardcore, like neuroscientists, there'll be there'll be a big gap between neurofeedback practitioners and the neuroscientists, where it's like a lot of neuroscientists don't believe in neurofeedback because they're so, I don't know, entrenched in certain methodologies where it's like, oh, like, the brain can't change in some ways. Like, people there's a lot of separation. So that's always like the funnest thing to me is like really trying to convince, someone who has that neuroscience
Have you heard of the curse of
PhD.
expertise?
Yeah.
So you made me think of that because I did a video about 2-3 months ago on the psychology of being an expert, and I cited the work of a guy named Anders Ericsson, and he
Yeah.
recently died about 2 years ago or 3 years ago in 2020, and he did a lot of work on the best in almost every field: chess, music, sport, CEOs, doctors. And one thing I learned researching that podcast episode was that the people who were higher up using doctors, this was the best example, and I cited it in my podcast, was that who would you want to be your doctor? And people would say, oh, the person who's been a doctor for 30 years, opposed to the person who's been a doctor for 4 years. And they say, actually, statistically speaking, you probably want the person who's 4 years, for the fact that the person who's 30 years been there so long, they've developed these ideologies that they're kind of married to. They're less enticed to want to learn the new stuff.
Hmm.
So that kind of could be what happening when you say what you say, because since they are so knowledgeable and they know what they've done for 20 plus years, it's
Yep.
kind of like, this is newer or different to what I do.
Yep.
Since I know what I know, does this really help me? When honestly it could, but I think that happens a lot. So with that being
Definitely.
said, hi, I'm a PhD.
Yeah, you're a PhD. So your brain communicates on a chemical and electrical level. So with EEG technology, we're able to measure the electrical signaling that's taking place between neurons that's creating our thoughts, emotions, behaviors, cognitive abilities, our whole consciousness. There's not going to be any debate about that. EEG is very well accepted. As far as with neurofeedback, we're going to be picking up that EEG data from a bunch of different areas of your brain through electrodes that are being placed on the scalp. And then, based on the direction we're trying to change your brain, if we're trying to improve your focus, and we know that beta brain waves is a focused, alert, awake state, then we can teach your brain and reward your brain for producing more beta waves. So, how we do that is through basically operant conditioning. When the brain gets into that beta brainwave pattern, we give it a reward. The volume gets louder, the audio, you see your character run faster in the video game. So it's giving your brain auditory and visual feedback on when it's doing well, gives that positive reinforcement to continue creating those electrical rhythms. And then when your brain deviates from that healthy state, for instance, if we're training someone to be focused and they get out of that, they start mind wandering, they get into a drowsy kind of alpha theta brainwave pattern, then the reward's taken away. So your character, the volume gets really quiet, the character starts running slower. So it's providing your brain real-time feedback on when it's doing well in terms of its electrical signaling, when it's not. And then through operant conditioning, it encourages the brain to create more of the healthy rhythms and less of the unhealthy rhythms.
So I'm not a PhD. I got about no, not two thirds, maybe halfway there. But I would say yes, I agree, and I like that explanation. So I'll give
Cool.
them an A on all three
Right
explanations. Good
on.
stuff. Give them
It
round of
was a
applause
good
in the
question.
comments.
It was a good, and it's like, they say like to really like understand, like teaching stuff, you understand it way better. I feel like
Hmm.
it's like being able to actually explain that at those different grade levels. It helps me get better and better at crafting my spiel, because explaining neurofeedback to different people are going to respond to different things. The terminology I use talking to athletes or executives about neurofeedback training is much different than how I would talk to people at the substance abuse rehab. Or at least some of them. It's like I would always kind of gauge people's understanding of psychology, of neuroscience, of neuroplasticity, and then really cater my explanation to them. Because I think so often it's been like neuroscience has not been like a readily accessible or
Hmm.
understandable field. I think people like Andrew Huberman are doing huge things of like actually bridging that gap between the hardcore neuroscientist and the layperson who just wants to be able to like improve their brain health. So I really feel like a big role that I have is being able to actually translate those research studies, the hardcore neuroscience, into language that's going to be understood and digestible for the everyday person or for different types of people, so that they can actually apply this stuff, so they don't get weirded out by this techno babble, right?
Hmm.
Because that was my whole issue before, was like I got ended up going super deep within the field and reading all these 500-page textbooks on neurofeedback and QEEG, and it became really difficult trying to explain what neurofeedback is to
Hmm.
just Johnny on the street. So it's a really good exercise, because it's important to be able to communicate this material to different people and meet them where they're at.
I agree, because like you said, with the people, like going on what you mentioned about Dr. Huberman, and he's probably, I would safely say he's the most well-known person in maybe not just in the brain sciences, but maybe science in general,
Yeah.
right now at least.
Yeah.
Obviously you can go like, oh, the Einsteins and the Isaac Newtons and Benjamin Franklin's, but it's like given the current generation, I would hope the current generation younger than us knows those people
Yeah.
too. But as far as popularity, I definitely would say Dr. Huberman, Andrew Huberman is definitely in the forefront. And I think you made another comment with him saying how he makes it relatable for the non-academics. And I think the point you put out about the application, I think people like us, we're that gap even between that because while he does make it, he takes the research studies and breaks them down to an understandable level. But the application side, I think that's where the other side, and it's not a shot to him at all. It's just saying that now that you know it to at least a digestible level, put it into practice. Because of course he does give tools to put in
Mhm.
practice, but people like us, we have our boots on the ground,
Yes.
Like I don't knock research because I've published research articles. I've worked in labs, you've worked in labs. So it's like that's needed because how do we know what we're doing makes sense?
Mhm.
But at the same time, that piece of paper, those 10, 12, sometimes 15, 20 sheets of paper, how do you put that into a drill, a task,
Yep.
a tool to use in your quality of life? And that's why I feel what we're doing with our businesses is this is, I may be biased, but I think this is the missing link of it because how do we make the actual daily lives better? Because that's where it really happens.
Yeah. And if we want to actually get these modalities into as many people's hands as possible who can really benefit, who we know that can really benefit through this stuff, it takes more than just the researchers because the researchers are locked in their research lab. They're writing academic textbooks. Like a lot of
Mhm.
these people that I've studied with like things like brain photobiomodulation, like red and infrared light therapy for the brain. I've talked to these guys from Harvard, these researchers, and it's like they write academic textbooks. They don't speak or they speak at medical conferences and
Mhm.
events like no one knows about the benefits of brain photobiomodulation because there's not the person, the Huberman, who's like making it easily digestible and cool. So my whole thing is really like learning from all the best people, learning from all the experts, and then trying to figure out, okay, based on that, how can I like make this into material, into content? How do I explain it to people in a way that's going to be digestible so that they're actually going to see the benefit? Because that's the problem is no one I speak to so many people who've never heard about brain mapping, who've never heard about neurofeedback. Not only have they not done it, they've never even heard of it. They don't know
Yep.
these things exist and it's nothing new. That's what always trips me up is like people will ask me, okay, like, so is this like some new experimental like technology? I'm like, no, man, like
Like it's
QEEG,
almost a century
neurofeedback,
now.
exact.
Right?
It's gone back. So it's like there's so many research studies. There's so many research studies, yet no one actually like knows that it exists. So it's like that's the missing to me. It's like trying to fill that gap of bridging the gap between the research community with the everyday person who just wants to improve their brain. And I think being able to explain these things in a way that those people are going to understand is going to be able to actually take these technologies out of research. Well, they still need to be in research labs and small clinics. But my point is they've been buried away in these research labs and clinics, and they haven't made their way into the mainstream. I mean, not good enough marketing, whatever it is. But that's my goal really with Neuroflex is taking these technologies, bringing them to the peak performance community who I know can benefit, but it just hasn't made its way there yet.
Think it's just lost in translation because you mentioned technology, and this is my personal take on it. Because a lot of stuff that I do, I have all types of technologies I use, tools, but I have a lot of non-tech stuff and low-tech stuff that I use as well. And I'm very critical on it because I see them as tools and just that, like we mentioned off the podcast about having a toolbox. But I've seen a lot of practitioners, and I think it's mostly because they don't have backgrounds like us in the actual field. They're more so either sport people or some type of wellness coach or fitness person that likes it. And there's no disrespect to that because it's good because that means people are open to it. But it may do, I think, a small disservice because they rely too much on the tech, whether it's neurofeedback, whether it's some type of cognitive training tool or equipment. Because I have people I know who hit me up on IG or something and they'll say, "What do you think of insert product?" And you're probably just like me. You're probably going to feel me on this.
Hmm.
I spend a lot of time either getting them myself just because I want to test them out, or I've tried them with other people's facilities. And
Mhm.
I probably tried in at least my sector of this field, I would say 90% of the products out there. Either I own them, they're in this building right here, or I've used them. So when they ask me, it really comes from a place of I know. And the problem is, a lot of times they'll rely strictly on these things because they do have benefit, but it's like to beat this point down, there's no one-stop shop to do all this stuff. So I think the technologies definitely need to be there because they're objective, they're measurable, but sometimes people get too on them, and I think that's where the disconnect happens because I can't put insert product in my house, or I can't. In some you can, but they're still expensive, or it's just lack of knowledge. Because let's say I buy this $500 piece of equipment for neurofeedback or whatever it is, but I don't really know how to use it. And I have to watch all these. It discourages people. It's like,
Yeah.
let's be real. Let's take away brain science, psychology, all that away. At bare minimum, it's a consumerism business. So it's like, how do I get them consumed? If they got to do all these steps, why would they want to do it? And I think that's where not just researchers, but even practitioners miss the mark because we love it, we care, we know it, but they don't. So it's like we got to understand that. Not us maybe, but I think the industry as a whole needs to understand that.
Yeah. And relating to your point about people getting too caught up in like a specific technology, like neurofeedback, it's like, no, this is a tool in your tool belt. And, it's like when people think about going to the gym and working out, it's like as if people would just like, no one goes and it's just like, all I need to do is bench press
Exactly.
to get in good shape. All I do is bench press. And maybe there's some people that do that. I mean,
There
hell,
is
with
the bros.
the bros. Well, with running, I guess like running, there's the people who just run on the
Mhm.
treadmill, and it's like they get that certain type of body type. They burn all the fat, but they don't have that
Muscle.
muscle, right? So it's like in order to get in super good shape, it's like you got to do the cardio with the weight training. You got to like stack all these different things together. You rotate between going to chest press and bench press to shoulder press to leg press, to do all these different types of things or all sorts of calisthenics, whatever you're doing. But people, I feel like, understand the need for that, to go from thing to thing when it comes to training their body. But when it comes to training our mind, it's like, why don't we think of it in that same way? Why do we think, oh, I just need to do neurofeedback training, or I just need to do this, and then I'm going to be all good? It's like, to me, it's just integrating as many modalities that are beneficial for you and kind of putting together like a brain health, brain performance toolkit for yourself.
I think why it happens like that too is another opinion of mine. Not saying it's fact or law, but I think I'm using the term lazy, and I'm gonna explain why I say lazy. So I think people are lazy with the terms that relate to brain health, mental health. So say let's use the word motivation. That's probably the most motivation and confidence are probably the most used words when it comes to mental health and performance or brain health because it's easy to say, I need motivation or I need to be confident. So that's why I use the word lazy because once you say it, it's like, oh, okay, be confident. Say it's a fitness trainer, personal trainer. They say, I work on the body and the mind. I see this in people's taglines or their statuses or whatever. And since we're in this industry, I'm a little critical, not like to them, but I think like, how are you actually doing that? And
Mhm.
that's why I use the word lazy because it's easy to say, oh yeah, I work with the body and the mind. I had this guy who interned for me like 6 years ago. And I asked him that question. He's like, yeah, explain your philosophy and he was a more fitness trainer. So I was like, explain your philosophy. He's like, oh, I work, make your mind and body stronger and more efficient. So I was like, oh, cool. Explain how you do that. He got silent for like 20 seconds. And I looked at him like, and it wasn't to put him on the spot, but it's
Mhm.
like, I like the pride because going back to the lazy word, I know they probably mean well, but when we just cop out to like, you gotta feel better, that's it. It's just like going back to the fitness. You're not gonna say, oh, I want to work out. That doesn't get you in shape. I want to feel better, doesn't get you mentally better. So I think it's easier to cop out because it just sounds good in your head to say, I'm gonna believe in myself. And I'm not saying you shouldn't have what they call affirmations. I'm not knocking any
Mhm.
of that because you do need to reinforce those thoughts. But I just think we, as us, I think we're on the same page with this. I think we're both doing our due diligence. Obviously, we're only two people, but the bigger this gets, like you said off camera, we were talking about getting into prisons, getting into other entities where it's not traditionally thought of. This is where it's needed, but it's like quite the contrary. So let's segue into that. You explain, and this is something we can kind of go into how you implement this new program you have. You mentioned about the jail population. I've worked in jails before and I've worked with law enforcement. So people in prison probably not probably, I don't know the exact number, but they have a high rate of mental illness and they don't get treated. And then you talk about trauma, brain trauma, and all that. So let's go into, I guess, how that could look and how you would go about it.
Right? Because I think people, within the jail prison system, it's like not only is there the physical trauma of past head injuries, concussions from different fights they've got in, or all sorts of crazy stuff people have gone through, the emotional trauma of seeing crazy stuff. as well as like, I mean, yes, there's the mental and emotional trauma, there's the physical trauma, and then I feel like there's just, I don't know, it's just not a good people. They don't have good biological brain functioning, and I think that's like why the people like make those kind of stupid decisions that get themselves into that place in the first place. If you have a strong prefrontal cortex, that executive functioning, and you're able to inhibit impulses, and like you're not going to get yourself into prison. I think in most cases, obviously, there's people that are there unjustly that, and, like that, there's a lot of other stuff, but people that do get themselves into stupid situations and get there and get into fights, it's like there's a lot of like impulse control that's just not taking place there. And to me, that is strictly a brain health issue, an issue with the way their brain is functioning on a biological level because of all these things we mentioned, the emotional trauma, the physical trauma. So if we could actually do neurofeedback training with these individuals, rehabilitate their brains, because that's the idea, supposedly the idea between or behind like, rehabilitation centers, when in reality, prisons, oftentimes they're just storing people, right? It's like a not really a system of rehabilitation. So in my mind, neurofeedback training could be a component of improving their, biological functioning of people within the prison system. I don't think it's the be all end all. I think it's like, if you pair that with the coaching, with therapy, whatever else, whatever other tools like we're talking about, tools to stack together with that. But I think these people in inner city schools, people in prisons who've been through so much trauma, I mean, their brain is wired for fear. Their brain is wired for trauma. Their brain has not been, you know, conditioned and fed, the right foods, the right, all this stuff. So I think that, neurofeedback training could be a huge component of just improving that whole population, of just creating societal change by, each individual person's brain. 'Cause I think there's like a lot of issues where it boils down to people, not being able to communicate, not understanding each other. And the more I think we enhance our own brains, the more we develop that capacity to say like, I might not agree with you on everything, but I'm going to have the capacity to hear you out, to respect what you have to say, to respectfully disagree without it evolving into a brawl between us, in which I end up getting into trouble. So I think just that developing that self-regulation capability that tools like neurofeedback, meditation, all these things can provide, can keep so many people out of prison or out of substance abuse rehabs, but also the people who are already there, rehabilitate them so they're not going to get into these fights and stupid, decisions that get themselves back to jail, or to use substances to, self-medicate, when if you fix the underlying biological brain issues, they're able to feel calm without needing to drink a fifth of whiskey each night. So to me, it's all about fixing the brain on a biological level, and then people's behavior ends up getting so much better.
Yeah. Have you ever heard the term "I wasn't a criminal until I went to jail" or heard that phrase before?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I
And
know.
the reason I bring it up is because you mentioned like rehabilitation, and you talk about recidivism rates when they go back to jail. And it's like, you made a good point. When they go there, you get put in situations where you kind of have to acquiesce to what's going on in the prison, which makes you, like, say you went in there for something very petty, but then you get into a big brawl and you actually break someone's jaw because you try to protect yourself. Now you get things added to your charge. So now you're there longer. And guess what? You build a reputation. You might become the kingpin in there. You might not. But whatever it is, the effects of it is going to affect you when you get back out. And it's like that makes it easier to succumb to what got you there in the first place, probably even in a worse way. Usually it levels up. It's like you went there for a petty crime, it gets a little higher, then it gets a little higher. Then and it happens all the time. And going from the brain segue into something else that you made me think of while you're talking, this will really bring home like the physical aspects of the brain. And you've probably familiar with these just as much as I am, if probably more. Is I remember there was a study they did with prison inmates. I think there was ones either there for very violent crimes or maybe even death row, and they saw that they did an fMRI though, so it wasn't EEG, but basically it showed that they would show anxiety invoking words and neutral words. Like, so anxiety would be like knife, die, something like that. And then the neutral would be like chair, house, box. And they saw with the more adjusted brains, they would see the differences in the regions for the anxiety invoking words versus the neutral words. But the ones they were murderers or high violent offenders, they didn't see a difference. And that just speaks volumes when we talk about crime and like obviously there is consciousness to it. We can't dismiss that. There's a lot of tragedies that's happened, and I never want to be the person who says it's 100% neurological.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, there is decisions being made.
Correct.
But I always use the analogy of like, if you don't have that foundational like stability to make it, it makes it harder. So it's not an excuse to these people who commit these horrible crimes, but it's like getting to the point. Can we do something to limit this or reduce this? I don't think we could solve it completely. Obviously, the world's a crazy place. But like you said, we have the ability even to reduce it. That does so much.
Yeah, I think it also makes me think of the whole concept of free will. Like it's like to me, free will is like a percentage, right? Because if we completely saw everything, all the possibilities of all of our actions and everything
Mm.
going forward, I mean, we'd be like Bradley Cooper in the Limitless
You
movie,
seen
like on the
Adjustment Bureau?
NCT. I haven't seen that one.
Reason I brought it up because I remember that movie too, but Justin Bieber probably falls more in that analogy
Okay.
because in the movie it was Matt Damon. I forget who the co-star was. I think it was Emily Blunt. Basically, the whole movie was centered around him. Spoilers, by the way. So the whole movie was centered around him and his life. It started when he was a little bit younger, maybe early 20s or mid 20s, and everything he did, he met this girl who was played by Emily Blunt. It kept deterring him from her. He's like trying to go out with her, but it was always something deterring him. And then one day he went to his office to work and everyone was like frozen. And there's these people who, for lack of a better word, were called angels. And they had these like hats on and suits, like Dick Tracy looking guys. And he's like, they're like, you weren't supposed to see that. So it turns out they're called adjusters, and they basically shift your life. And it shows a book where it shows each pathway of if he goes out with her, this is where your life goes. If he doesn't, you become president. And that's why I said spoiler. So basically, it's like he was reshaping his life in real time due to this knowledge of where these paths would take him. And like you said, having that free will. Have you ever heard the expression of free won't?
No.
There was a
Tell me.
psychologist. He did a study, and you had I want to say it was like the late 80s or early 90s, but it's been replicated a few times. So basically, there was a timer ticking, like a 60-second hand on a clock, and it would just keep revolving, keep revolving. So your duty was to hit the space bar on the keyboard whenever you felt like it. That could be at the 40-second, 10-second, whatever. Just hit it. But then you had to report when you thought you wanted to hit it. So let's say, I wanted to hit it at 5 seconds, but you hit it at 10. So what they looked at is the EEG, where did the spikes and all that go off?
Mhm.
And a lot of times it wasn't congruent, meaning they actually had the thought before they thought they had the thought. If that makes sense.
Yeah,
I guess it does for
Yeah,
you. It
to
definitely
me,
makes
yeah.
sense. But for those watching, it's like, so it was crazy to see. So the guy, I can't remember his name, but he came up with the term free won't. And we talk about like impulse control. So it's like, is it that you have the will to do something, or you more so have the will to not do something that will interfere with whatever goal or behavior you're trying to do? So that was the concept. So I don't know how much research has been done on it, but I kind of like that premise of free won't. It's interesting because we always hear free will, but this was free won't.
Right. I mean, I like the concept because I feel like there's so many easy ways we could just completely ruin our life, right? Like there's so many things that if we do that we're not supposed to, like that could just derail everything. If you get in a drunk driving crash and kill someone, like that, like the ability to not do that, I mean, that's just considered like normal. Like we don't think about like, oh, like good for me that I didn't do that, right? It's like it'd be horrible if that did happen, but it's like those decisions, I mean, that could like completely derail your entire life making those stupid decisions. So I like that concept.
That's really going back to the whole brain side of things. I guess we can geek out on this, but for the people listening, it's like this just illustrates so perfectly how all these different. That's how I explain it to people who work with me, whether they're clients or organizations. I'll always explain it in the mindset of you have sets of behaviors that you have to entail in your day to day life. That's just what it is. Whether it's getting up for work, taking care of your kids, your dog, loving your wife or husband, whatever it is, you have to do these XYZ behaviors. But there's always going to be things that's going back to like the impulse thing that could either impede on these behaviors, could enhance these behaviors, but are you making the cognitive processes at the foundational level that even get you to that behavior? Because it sounds cliche, but the brain controls everything, obviously. So it's like, why aren't we doing the things that can enhance that, whether it be a cognitive task, like say the Stroop effect or a working memory task, or doing neurofeedback, or doing the traditional, oh, just go for a run. Those, they always say the endorphins. And I've done a video about the actual aspect of that with the endocannabinoids, because people always go to endorphins, but never talk
Right.
about
You're right. Yep.
endocannabinoids. So it's like we know all these things. So it's like we have to get to them in that way because this is how it actually looks in real time. And I think that's what the people need. People like us saying how there's more than one way to skin a cat, like, right? So it's like we really got to illustrate this different facets of how the brain implements these behaviors. So we need to do things that facilitate that improvement.
I think another great point, like, or thing to add on to this is like the idea where I feel like a lot of people, maybe not high performers, but a lot of people just in general society will only do things when they feel like doing
Yep.
it, right? It's like they're so caught up in their emotions where it's like if they don't feel like working out, then they're not going to work out. And that's, oh, so I just didn't feel like doing this. But it's like, as you and I know, so much of it is about showing up and doing the work, whether we feel like there's some days we're going to show up and we're going to be ecstatic and ready to do stuff and we're going to feel like doing it. But if we don't show up on the days that we do not feel like doing it, I mean, I remember a high school basketball coach that drilled that into me where it's like, it's easy to show up for the game, when it's all exciting and everyone wants to play. It's not easy to show up for the 6 a.m. practice in which you got to put up shot after shot after shot. Like, so it's like that's the difference I feel like between people who are uber successful and that really comes down to that ability to like in uh my opinion kind of like inhibit kind of delay gratification, right? Where it's like there's certain things like we might get more enjoyment out of laying on the couch and watching Netflix. That might feel subjectively better than going to the gym when we don't feel like it and getting a hard workout in. But what's going to get us the long term results we're looking for? That good feeling good is not like watching Netflix. That's not going to really get you to anywhere you want to go in life, but you're going to feel good. That's I feel like where so many people get confused because it's like, well, if it feels good, then it's like I should be doing it, right? But it's like
Mhm.
there's plenty of behaviors, addictive behaviors where people get in that dopamine loop where it's like scrolling,
Yep.
where it's like it's clearly not good, but it feels good. And people, I think, just get the two confused so much.
I think we're now veering to, I like to talk about this. It's not my forte, but evolutionary psychology, because I always use this term as I use it probably way too much now. I always say there's no more saber-toothed tigers. So it's like going to that point. The only reason we can feel good because there's so much things that don't kill us now. So think about this. We don't have to go back 10,000. We can go back 100 years. There's a lot less survival. Well, now we're in the 2020s, maybe 150 years, but there's a lot more things to adjust our lives where we don't have to worry about survival things. Because you go back 150 years, that wasn't that long. That's like 7 generations, maybe 6, 7 generations for some people. And it's like just staying alive was more so not having enough food to eat and not getting sick. That was it. Obviously, you worked, whether it was at a job or you had a farm, whatever. Agriculture wasn't really about big business back then. You worked the farm to feed you and your family. And there's an author, his name's Dr. Tai Tashiro, and he actually was my first guest on this podcast. He has a best-selling book called The Science of Happily Ever After. And in the book, one of the chapters, he broke down love to like calorie expenditure. It was so cool how he did it
Mm.
because it was like the late 1800s, like 1880s, I want to say, and the estimated calorie expenditure for the average person was about 1700. So by that logic, if you work the fields, if you expend more than that, but you can reap the food that, because plants just don't come up overnight. Like you have to tend the field, you have to make sure they grow healthily, and then you can reap the benefit. So it's like if that doesn't go the way it needs to do, and you just burn all this calorie work, and you only was able to produce so much food for your family and you're undernourished. Guess what? You're starved. So it's like the logic going into why marriage was so important, because that's what that was more so about. And this is why I bring it full circle is like you had to get married so you could have kids, because more kids mean more workers. More workers means the greater you can get done with expending less calories. So going back to the point why we can sit and watch Netflix for 4 or 5 hours straight, binge watch, which is I'm not against it. Like, hey, if you have a time off, you want to relax, fine. But it's like when we do it every day, I would never knock him, because I have days where it's like I'm big on being mindful. Use the term mindful. Like, you know what? I worked 100 hours this week between calls, sessions, whatever, planning. I'm gonna watch a movie. It's no harm. But when it's like every day you're watching 5, 6 hours of TV or stuff, then going to what you said with the brain, that feedback of like this is what the brain's gonna keep wanting. And Like, I want to ask you this, and I want to hear what you think, or your even maybe how you would go about it. So going off what you said with emotions are fleeting. That's what I always say. Because what you feel right now, like say neurochemicals, that's going to be gone in 5 minutes. So from that standpoint, how would you say in general, not necessarily like a professional opinion, but how would you in general advise someone to not stifle, but kind of, I guess, stunt those emotions so you don't do the wrong thing? Because that could hinder a business deal, can hinder a relationship, can hinder a sport event. So how would you personally go about it? Because you have a pretty diverse life background.
I mean, I feel like it's all about taking a pause, like not saying the first thing that comes to our mind, like taking a minute to actually be able to gather our thoughts, if we're going to be in a heated situation or something, like instead of just saying the first, like whatever your emotions tell you to say. I feel like in my life and just seeing other people, like you end up often getting yourself into trouble if you just go off of those like impulses, whatever those first thoughts might be to say. So for me, it's like all about taking a pause and kind of like letting those emotions settle down. So I'm able to actually see more of the logic of, okay, I feel this way, but is this really going to be like a good like what's going to be the best way to go about this to get, the outcome that I'm wanting, right? Like if it's like, if back when I was like working for other people and it's like, if I have a boss and it's like, I'm upset about a certain issue and I just want to complain about it versus like if I think about it for a second, I'm like, oh, well, the boss is actually, they're just going to get annoyed if I complain. But if I actually propose an alternative solution that's going to make their lives easier, that's going to make my life easier, then they'll be receptive. A lot of people just go and complain because that's like their emotional impulse, right? To complain. But it's like, if you can, I think like looking deeper at these situations and really thinking like, okay, the person I'm interacting with, like what are they going to want and what am I going to want and how to best handle that. So it's really, I guess, very logical oftentimes the way I go about like handling things and like trying to let the emotions like settle down. I feel like, like being in love, people fall in love and it's like, it's like their minds are like so flooded with dopamine. It's like people do like people get into these terrible relationships where it's like all their friends see it. They see how like toxic this
Mhm.
person is and they're telling them, but it's like the person, it's not that they don't, like they literally can't see it. I really think for a lot of people, they can't see it because their brains are so flooded with dopamine and all these positive feel good chemicals. So it's like, I think that's like an example in which people get into trouble sometimes of being so overtaken by their emotions. We always like talk so great about falling in love and
Yeah.
and being in love, right? And it's like, it's a great thing like when it's the right person, right? But fall in love with the wrong person, that's a pretty good way to ruin your life
I
real
would
quick.
I would even argue that going back to say using logic, I think you should be more logical than love. Not saying because like you said, love is great and it's a good feeling, once again, emotion, but emotions, they cloud our judgment.
Exactly.
We can get into the neuroscience of like fight or flight. That's your emotional response to fear and stress. Guess what? You don't make the best decisions in that state. That's why you have to train yourself to be less impulsive, be logical, think it through. It seems cliche to say this, but people don't this is why there's a big prison population. Let's be real. That's really what it comes down to. Their emotions took control. And it's not sometimes you can say not justified, but you can see the logic of why they did it. Oh, I'm hungry. I robbed someone. I needed
Mhm.
money. It doesn't make it right, but I get that emotional decision. But now another scenario, say this guy bumped me in the shoulder and I like how he disrespected me. He's from another neighborhood. Boom, he's dead. That's emotion. But guess
Mhm.
what? If he thought, if I pull out this gun, just pulling it out, that's 5 to 10 years. Shoot it, 10 to 20. Shoot someone, they don't die, 25 to life for attempted murder. Kill them, life. Or to chair, depending on your state. And all that came from an emotional feeling of, I didn't like how he hit or bumped my shoulder or she looked at me or whatever the reasoning is. And this is something I don't think we talk about in this field a lot because obviously on the more psych side, they'll talk about emotions, but it's just like you mentioned, it's more on the happy-go-lucky side. Like, be in tune with your emotions. What does that truly mean?
Yeah.
I really think being in tune with your emotions is really being able to say, nope, don't give in to them. Because a
Mhm.
lot of people want to play the give into them. Like, even I don't want to get into this side, but like as men, a lot of times the narrative is show your emotions, be vulnerable. And I would argue, and this might be a not popular opinion, I would say no. And if you are vulnerable, do it to someone that 100% can get where you're coming from. Because if I am going to use my emotions, I still need some logic there. Because if it's just like, oh, I feel this way, and you're like, oh, that's okay, feel that way, it's okay, and that's where it ends, you don't help me, I don't get help. What are we doing here? Versus, hey, you have similar walks of life. I can vent to you or be vulnerable to you. You say, man, I went through that once, or I know someone went through that once. How can we get this better? Well, maybe if I did, okay, let's do that. Guess what? I was emotional, but it still made sense. So I think that's the narrative. Like, I know it's kind of off top, but still on because it's brain stuff. But I seen a meme go viral probably the last few weeks of saying, men, it's okay to be vulnerable to us, women. And almost every man was saying, nah, I'm good. And I kind of get why they said it, but all the girls who were coming is like, oh, you're messing with the wrong girls. And it's like, by saying that, you just proved that I can be vulnerable with you because I admitted that I haven't had good experience with that, and you're telling me what to think. So by literal logic, you proved that wrong. So get to my point, all full circle is just like, we need to use less emotion in the sense of when we should be emotional, use a little logic, and you should be logical, use a little emotion. I feel that balance can maybe get you further in general, not just like love or staying out of prison, but like you still need to have emotion. Like as a business, I can't just be like, up, screw it. I don't know this person. Bye. Wait, what? Hear this story. So yeah, it's so much with that. So yeah.
Yeah, but I like relating to the vulnerability component. I really think it's like it's choosing, being able to pick and choose, because it's like if you're vulnerable and you share your deepest fears and insecurities with the wrong person, they can then use that stuff against you.
Yep.
That's dangerous. You're giving people like the bullets to shoot you, in my
Yep.
opinion. Like that's not a good idea. Whereas
Mhm.
like, I don't think there's anything wrong with like, crying in front of your girl if you're like, you just lost a friend or something. It's like you're being vulnerable because the situation's like super sad and devastating. And like, your girl's going to like be there for you and be supportive. I think there's a time and a place for that. But this whole like movement of just like making men like super like emotional and in tune with their feelings, I think is really trying to feminize men in a lot of ways, and not a good thing in terms of that masculine feminine polarity. I think women want masculine men, and as men, I want like a feminine, like emotional woman. I don't want necessarily a super like logical, like, you know what I'm
Mhm.
saying?
I get what because it's like perfect. You made a perfect point. It's like they want the vulnerability and emotionality of them
Mhm.
and you as a larger, more muscular, more masculine. Because going back to evolutionary psychology, we haven't been that far removed from ancient times as far as a social and physiological construct. We're not that different from if you took a person from 2000 BC and someone from 2023, so 2000 year difference or 4000 year difference, and not to get graphic, they had no clothes on. You would not know what time period they came from. Obviously, you see someone in a toga or a whatever, it's like, why are they dressed like that? Is it a costume party? But if you take that away and they're just say they're both wearing boxers, you don't know anywhere where they came from. So getting to my point is like we're not that far removed from that. So this narrative that they say, oh, but it's different times. Like honestly, yes. But in the last 50, 60 years, it's almost we're in a science experiment. We haven't seen the results of this yet.
Mhm.
Our generation, us, when we're like 70, 80, we live to be that long, that's when it's going to start showing what happened in the 50s to now. That's going to be the product. So this whole narrative, like being more vulnerable and being more emotional, I'm fine with it in the sense of to the right people, like you said, but to have this that you want just a masculine woman as a man, meaning like a man who just has all the qualities of women. I think that's detrimental. This is my psych brain
Mhm.
talking. That's just this ingenuous to any relationship, especially a romantic when it's like you just want me or you inside my body.
Yeah.
That's not who I am. And that's almost like I'm like a Frankenstein. Like
Right.
that's not what we are. So it's just interesting how like all this and this the funny thing is this all comes back to mental and brain health. Even though we
Yeah.
kind of veered, and that's I guess to illustrate our points is it all matters.
Yeah. And to go back to something we were talking about before, of you were talking about like, when people like make those wrong decisions, it's like you could pull out a gun and you get 10 years for that, and life for shooting the person. It's like I really don't think that people are in their right mind. I mean, they're not in their right mind making those decisions. And I think the perfect way to illustrate that is, for instance, like I used to have a lot of social anxiety where I could prepare all I want. I could rehearse the speech that I was about to give in front of the class, for days. I would rehearse it like so many times to the mirror, to my mom, and it was like, because I didn't have a good control over my nervous system, when I got up in front of the whole class, my mind went completely blank. because I was just in that state of fight or flight. And we know, like now knowing like neuroscience, it's like that shuts down the prefrontal cortex, that ability to think clearly. Our amygdala has just gone haywire and we're in that super emotional response. We literally cannot make good, clear decisions. So I honestly have a lot of empathy for people who do, or I feel like it makes sense, like why certain times people get in those bad situations because they're not thinking right.
Mm, definitely, I agree. So basically, this has all been good stuff. So before I close things out, every time I do this podcast, I call it the take home two. So the point of it is short to the point, doesn't have to be too short, but something straightforward, that two things that you can give the audience that they can directly put into practice. Doesn't require a lot of extra effort, thought, to take home two. So what do you have? You can take a second, think of it, or if you have something to go, what do you got?
I'd say first, believe that your brain can actually change and improve, because they've shown with certain studies where if people believe that their intelligence is fixed and that they can't improve their intelligence, then they can't. And people who believe that it's fluid and that they can grow their intelligence, then they show that they can. So it's literally, if you don't believe that your brain can change and improve, I think you could do all the neurofeedback, all the brain training, but our thoughts are so powerful that if we have that deeply ingrained subconscious belief that our brain, that we're stuck with the brain that we have today, and if we don't like that brain, then I think that sabotages so much of people's ability to actually change and improve their lives. And the second, I would say, man, one thing, just an actionable thing that people can do that goes back to my point of like, really liking, stacking together different modalities. Exercising at the beach. Think about the different
Mm,
modalities, the benefits you're getting. You're getting the sunlight exposure, you're getting the negative ions from the water, you're getting the grounding, like walking on the sand, the earth, you're getting the exercise. Like that to me is like an awesome way to just like start my day. I mean, that's why I moved to Florida. Honestly,
a lot of
I grew up in
beaches.
Oregon. It was depressing. It was rainy all the time, like 8 months of the year. I was like, couldn't do this anymore. So
Mm,
coming to Florida, I feel like it's like if I do that, if I exercise on the beach, it's like if I start my day like that, I can't have a bad day. Like how can I be mad? How can I be depressed after doing that? So to me, I think that's a great thing people can go and implement, completely free to do that. But you're getting like all these biohacking modalities. It's like they're just taking people back to nature, right? PEMF, grounding, right? It's like you
mm,
can get that same grounding just walking barefoot, right? But you could also buy a
mhm.
expensive
Yeah.
PEMF machine, right?
Yeah.
And the same thing with like all these other biohacking tools where I feel like
And
nature has all the tools, but I guess technology is able to create some cool
yeah,
stuff.
it's going back to us adapting in our where we at in society. But good stuff though. That's pretty good. So plug where can they find you, what you got going, anything out right now you want them to hear and know about?
Yeah, I would say definitely, check me out on Instagram, shoot me a message, Neuroflex. If you have any questions, comments about, anything we talked about, I'm happy to start a dialogue, talk to anyone who wants. In terms of what I got going on, basically a virtual neurofeedback and brain scan program that we just launched. So now instead of people, just needing to work with people face to face in South Florida, we can actually ship these devices directly to you anywhere that you are in the whole country or even the world. So I'm really passionate now about getting the different tools, neurofeedback and brain mapping into as many people's hands as possible. And I'd love, if you're interested in being able to optimize the biological functioning of your brain in order to have better performance, in order to improve your mental health, neurofeedback training can be immensely beneficial. And if you do that based on the brain scans, specifically what areas of your brain are deficient or overactive and how you can best tailor that approach to training your unique neurophysiology. I think that's the way to go. So if you're interested in that, you can check me out on Instagram or go to the website www.neuroflex.tech.
All right. So good stuff. So thanks for coming by. I know it's been a long time coming. I'm glad to finally make it happen. I think it's going to be going for the book. So thanks people at home for tuning in. And as always, get your mind right.